Hey everyone, Sky here to discuss A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, starring Tom Hanks, Matthew Rice, Susan Kelechi Watson, and Chris Cooper, and directed by Marielle Heller. Now, I do remember going to theaters for this before I ever saw Frozen 2 when I was watching that for my first viewing. And what do I think of the movie? Well, it's about to be the same as what I think of it now. But did I grow up with Mr. Rogers as a kid? No, I didn't. Even though this movie's supposed to take place in like around the time that I was alive or something. So let's get into the movie, and I'm curious to know what he's like in real life. Let's go ahead and get started. We open the movie with the TV show introduction of Mr. Fred Rogers, who's being portrayed by Tom Hanks, as this is inspired by a true story as he sings "It's a Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood" as he's all about kindness. And I really like Tom Hanks in this role as Mr. Rogers, as he tells the story of a man who has yet to forgive, named Lloyd Vogel, played by Matthew Rice, who lives in New York City and whose father has hurt him over the years, as the movie takes place in 1998, as he's married with a kid named Gavin, with Andrea, played by Susan Kelechi Watson, as they go to a wedding of Lloyd's sister Lorraine, with their father Jerry, played by Chris Cooper, who's an actor I've really enjoyed in so many movies, and I like him here as well, as he walked down at Lorraine's wedding. And Lloyd is still upset with Jerry for his past, as Jerry is drunk and Lloyd punches him for talking about his mother. And Mr. Rogers explains with the video about how to make a magazine, and the fact magazines tell some interesting stories and facts about a certain something that anybody would like to know how to make a magazine, as Lloyd works for a magazine company, as his boss Ellen asks him to write 400 words about Mr. Rogers. And I do like the characters, and I like what we'll learn as a message throughout the movie, as this is a beautiful movie with a beautiful story and a beautiful message, which I'll talk about throughout the show. Just great message. Lloyd travels to Pittsburgh, which is in Pennsylvania, to have an interview with Mr. Rogers while on 20-minute breaks, as he enters the studio and sees how he works in the studio as they film him putting together a tent, which is a very hard thing to, and he has a very hard time doing that, and it is a hard thing to do in general. And they talk as he tells Lloyd he's from a town not from far from Pittsburgh called Latrobe. And they talk about Lloyd and what happened to his face for a moment, and he watches Mr. Rogers portraying a puppet named Daniel, as Lloyd witnesses Mr. Rogers making a voice for Daniel, and he feels inspired, kind of, by, but doesn't know it quite yet. And he watches interviews with Mr. Rogers on the videotapes, and Lloyd says something that makes him feel inspired, like he's a very nice man. As he watches him being interviewed by Oprah, and he learns to forgive, well, sort of forgive his father, but not too much. As he watches Mr. Rogers' interviews and some shows as he learns forgiveness, which is a beautiful message, in my opinion, anyways. Mr. Rogers goes to New York City as they watch a few people perform music and perform one of his own songs, and Lloyd meets his wife Joanne as her husband is not a perfect person. Like, nobody's perfect, but he works at being kind to everyone, and I do enjoy the message so much. Mr. Rogers and Lloyd go in the subway, and people notice him and sing his theme song, which is a very heartwarming scene, and I love the fact that the movie's message is, despite we're not perfect people, we all could use a little kindness, which is a very beautiful message in my opinion. Lloyd gets comfortable telling Mr. Rogers about his special toy named Rabbit, and his mother, as Mr. Rogers, introduces Lloyd, Daniel, and King Friday the 13th, as Lloyd talks about Mr. Rogers. And yes, that's his name, King Friday the 13th. And he talks about Mr. Rogers' sons, as the older is distant and the younger tested him in the past, and how being a patient is not a perfect thing, which is a part of life. Lloyd gets home and sees Jerry with a woman he's been dating for 15 years named Dorothy, and immediately kicks him out, and they talk trash to each other as his mother died in the past, and Jerry gets a stroke and goes to the hospital, and Lloyd and Andrea have an argument about what's more important between work and family, but he goes to Pittsburgh for work, which is a selfish act from Lloyd, as on an episode of Mr. Rogers' show where they talk about hospitals and confesses his feelings while his father is in the hospital, and he sees a vision of his mother while lying in the hospital, which did make me cry, admittedly. And that's when he learns forgiveness while fainting on the show is in Mr. Rogers' apartment with his wife Joanne as they learn to play piano and sounds beautiful. And I have to confess, I cried during these scenes. It's just it's just so heartwarming. Lloyd and Mr. Rogers go out to eat, and Mr. Rogers gives Lloyd a minute exercise to take a minute and think of all the people who loved us into being, as the movie takes a minute of silence as Lloyd feels better about himself. And I really like the technique of where they put the scene in silence. It was a brilliant move of the movie to make Lloyd gets back to New York and talks with Andrea about how he has to work on his temper and apologizes to Andrea for how he left. And he decides to go to see Jerry as we learn he's dying, which did make me sad, and begins to forgive Jerry as he goes to his house alone to visit him, which is the right thing to do, by the way, folks. And I do like the camera work, as sometimes we get to New York versus Pittsburgh, and sometimes we see a claymated world of Mr. Rogers' show. Andrea and the baby comes to visit Jerry while Lloyd is there to see how Jerry is doing. Lloyd cheers the baby up as he sings to the baby at 4 a.m., and Jerry overhears the song in his bed. Yes, that's where he was dying in. We'll get there. And Lloyd checks up on Jerry and have a drink together as Jerry confesses how cruel it was to leave him, his mother, and Lorraine, and says how sorry he really is, and says how much he always loved him. And Lloyd says he loves him too, which is a beautiful moment of the film. Lloyd writes 10,000 words. Some is about Mr. Rogers, and the other is about Lloyd himself and what he learned from Mr. Rogers. And Andrea and his boss Ellen loves it, and as it's printed, Jerry loves it as well, and Lorraine and her husband come by, and so does Mr. Rogers as he visits Jerry and eats pie with them, and talks about death with life included, which is life admittedly. Mr. Rogers takes a picture of the whole family and whispers something to Jerry's ear about praying for him, which is such a very good thing to do when someone is dying, and eventually Jerry dies, and the people who he loved were at the funeral, and Lloyd talks with Andrea about staying home with Gavin and the baby to get him daycare. Mr. Rogers sends a beautiful message about how he likes us for who we are, and the studio wraps up filming as Mr. Rogers watches the remaining footage of what they just filmed and plays the piano as the movie ends, and I thought that was a beautiful ending as well as a beautiful climax. Now it's time for the rating. I'll give this movie a 9.0 out of 10. This was a beautiful movie with a beautiful story and a beautiful message, and I do like these characters quite a bit as they're so also relatable. There were a couple of times I did cry during the movie because as everyone should know, we all need a little kindness in our lives, and I do like the times it goes from Mr. Rogers' claymated world to New York and Pittsburgh, as it was well made, and I recommend anyone who knows Mr. Rogers and haven't seen this yet to go check it out. It's pretty inspiring. So I would like to thank you guys for joining me, and next time I will be back with, well, in a couple of minutes, anyways, with a beautiful mind. So until then, it's a beautiful day in the neighborhood.